In this first tutorial, we're going to be looking at the new template for setting cycle tests or exams or class tests, and just some of the new features. You'll notice that we're now using Times New Roman, and this is to match the final department exams in the Trig and to have some consistency across the grades. We will also be looking at using the graph program to draw algebraic graphs and trig graphs, and I'll also be going through some equation tips and tricks in another video. So initially we're going to look at starting with this template and adapting it for each grade, the sort of standard practice that we should be going through every single time we set a test. And then I've chosen some questions that we're going to work through that highlight some of the aspects of setting the test that we encounter, maybe we have struggled with in the past. I've also tried to think of a consistent way to achieve these ends. I realize that there may be other ways to get the same result, but when it comes to the possibility of somebody else having to work with you on an exam or take over from you, we need to have some sort of uniformity. And so if we're all working according to this basic template and these basic principles, then I think it's going to be much more consistent going forward. So in this tutorial, we'll look at editing all of this, but these are the questions that I've set for us to do. So we're going to look at some of the equation editor things. We're going to look at here how we can use a fraction within text and make those two things consistent. We'll look at numbering conventions that are used in Trig. I've chosen quite a complex graph, again with a complex blurb, to see that we can make these two things consistent. And this graph is going to be drawn in graph.exe, which is a separate program. Then we'll look at some geometry. This is a sort of lower grade geometry writer. And then we'll look at some more complex. I know this is probably only applicable to the grade 12s, but again, there might be some principles that you might want to incorporate into a question that you're setting. We'll look at how do we draw analytical geometry, in particular circles. And finally, we'll do an Ogive or a cumulative frequency graph and how we can do this using the built-in graph tools within Word. So this is the template that we are now moving over to. You'll see that we've started off with the important things that need to be checked every time in red. You'll notice that you won't be able to save this document directly. It's a read-only document. So the first thing that we always do is we're going to choose to save it as, and then we can go and choose here where we would like to save it. So in my Google Drive, I normally have a shortcut here to this year, and then I'll have my assessments, and then let's say that this is a grade 12, term 1, cycle test, and then I can choose here to say, right, this is the NHS 2021 T1 grade 12 cycle. And I like to have some way of keeping track, otherwise you end up with final versions. So just using version 1 keeps track of where in the moderation process we are. So with this being a grade 12 test, I'm going to go through here and change this to grade 12. I'm going to change this to my name. Right, this is a term 1 cycle. The date, well, we check that there, but this is going to be somewhere in March. So let's say it's the 17th of March. 60 minutes for a cycle test, but in grade 12 we use 50 minutes for 50 marks in 60 minutes. So I go check through those things now. I can see are all correct. So I highlight everything. I choose my font here and I'm going to make it all black. I'm going to leave this red here because I'm not quite sure yet how many questions I'm going to have, and that might change in the moderation process. As well as these 3 pages, we're not sure how many pages, so we'll leave that there. Again, I'm going to leave this instruction there until we know what the final test is going to look like. Then you'll notice here that the first page doesn't have a header or a footer, but the second page does have a header and a footer. So we're going to edit this by double clicking in that space. I'm going to change this here to a term 1 cycle test. And of course, you can change these for exams. Grade 12, and check the year. All right, that is all now correct. Make it black. And I hit escape there to get out, or you can click in the normal space. I go down there, my footer here seems correct. And you'll see now that this has been updated for all of the pages. All right, so let's start setting our test. Okay, you'll notice something new in the table setup, and this follows from the metric template that they use, is that we do work in tables, and you'll notice that, well, you should notice that you can see grid lines. If you can't see any of the grid lines around these things, then you click next to question 1, for example, to make sure you're in a table. And then you're going to go up here on your ribbon and go down here to choose your borders, but you've got to make sure that view grid lines is shown. Without the grid lines, you won't see the borders. And so if you click on view grid lines, we can now see the constraints that we're working within. You'll notice that there's a gap between the question 1 and 1.1. Often in final exams, when we've got more space and we try to have one question per page, sometimes you can even have a double space from the question number till we start 1.1. One of the confusing things that can happen with tables is that if I was to delete this row here, this table now merges. And so suddenly now it becomes difficult with working with tables to have the correct spacing, and you don't really want to start messing with the heights of rows. So if that happens where your table merges when it shouldn't be merged, up in your table tools at the top of your ribbon here, one of the options that you have is to split the table. So if I have my cursor next to 1.1 as it is, and I click on split table, it then separates those rows. And then I'm back to where I started. Okay, so question 1.1, we're going to say make this a straightforward solving equation, so solve for. Now, if you want to insert your equation, you normally go insert equation for x. I am going to do a separate tutorial on some of the shortcuts that you can use with the equation editor. Now, technically, this font will not match this, but they're similar enough that I think it's going to be more consistent going forward to have our text in Times New Roman and our fonts might be in Cambria. All right, so the first equation, I'm going to use the shortcut for inserting the equation now, which is to hold down Alt plus. That puts the equation there. All right, I'm going to type my equation in. X squared minus 5x is equal to 6. Now this is center justified, which is the default for tables. So I'm going to go here and left justify it. You can also use the shortcut Control L. All right, when I type that there, I know my mark allocation for this is going to be for 3 marks. Okay, the next equation, I'm going to use a fraction. So again, I insert my equation. I'm going to start off with 5, and then I'm type / to get me a fraction. I use my left key, and then I can type in my denominator, use my right key to go next to it, plus type another fraction in. At the top, you've got 3x plus 1 is equal to 2, and then Control L will left justify it. We put in a mark allocation here of 5. Okay, right, now you'll notice that it's already populated for 1.2. So with no sub-question here, if I want a very common initial question in grade 11 and 12 is to say, solve the following equations simultaneously. Right, so I've got that there. And then here now I've got my space. And then this next table here, I'm not going to change the numbering. I'm going to type my equation in that space provided. So I've got a y plus 7 is equal to 2x. Left justify that. Now I'm going to go push right to go outside of my equation. Give myself some space and go and. Give myself some more space here. And go x squared. Okay, And with this now in that row, I'm going to make this here for 6 marks. Now I'd like to introduce a new question, 1.3. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure you've got some space here to work in. So I'm going to double enter, and then I'm going to copy that. I'm using the shortcut Control C, otherwise you can say copy and then paste here, Control V. I'm going to change this instruction and change my numbering, 1.3. So this is a more complicated setup of a question. I'm going to give them some information. Right, so I've set up the equation here now. Now this should be concerning you slightly, that the fraction here is much smaller. The fonts here are smaller than our other equations. And the reason for that is that this now, when I try and insert equation next to text, it uses what's called an inline equation. And it tries to match the heights as close as possible. So we're going to look at a couple of ways to fix that and to have this equation match those fonts. But before we get to that, we want to now introduce sub-questions here, 1.3.1. So then I'm going to go and copy one of my previous cells that was already split. Give myself some space, paste that in, change my numbering, 1.3.1. Now here I'm going to use this information, but I actually want to ask a couple of sub-questions first. So I'm going to give the instruction. And then now the convention says that if we need to have a 1.3.1 split, then we're going to split it into A and B. So I can copy this same one here, but now we don't want this information. We're going to delete that. We also don't want this mark allocation, but we will have a mark allocation for this. So we now want question A to be here. But if you see the way that we've been using the gaps between sub-questions, we really would like to split the cell into another 2 columns. So under layout here, with my cursor inside that cell, I'm going to say here, not split table, I'm going to say split the cells into 2 columns. Now you'll notice that over here, when I move my mouse over that, I can now go and add another indent for a question A. And then I can go here and match that to say, right, I want now if k equals 2, what's the nature of the roots there? And I'm going to go and make this 2 marks here. I'm going to have a B, so I'm going to copy that. I'm going to change this to B. And now I'll make it k equal to 0. I have 2 different types of questions there. All right, so that's 1.3.1 split into A and B. I now want to go and follow up with a 1.3.2. So this is going to be 1.3.2. And I'm going to say here, so that's now indented according to 1.3.1, 1.3.2, and I give this here 3 marks. Now that my question is finished, my total for this question should be here 21 marks. So in the square brackets, which are also bolded, I enter 21, and then we can delete those rows so that now the 21 is justified under these. Okay, let's go back and fix this equation. And there's a couple of ways to fix it. I'm going to show you another way when we get to the hyperbola. But this is a good example because this equation is at the end of a sentence. I can put it in its own cell, and then it will not be next to text, and it will be a normal equation split over 2 lines, much like 1.1.2. So I'm going to, with my cursor in the by here, I'm going to go into my layout, and I'm going to say split cells into 2. Then I'm going to highlight this equation. I will cut it, and I will paste it here. Control L to left justify it. Now, this doesn't look good running over here, but if we just move this there, now we have the equation at its full side. But we've introduced a new problem that 1.3 and the text here is aligned at the top of the cell. But because of the size of this, we can't match the alignment. One of the ways to get a close approximation, which is maybe the easiest in this situation, is to highlight these two cells. And to then, inside the layout of your table, you can see here the different justifications within the table. If we go align center left, now we're pretty close to that. But pretty close might not be good enough. So I'm going to undo that. And we're going to use the paragraph line spacing to try and more closely match the X with the by. So if you click on the arrow next to it here, we can go here into the line spacing options. And what we want to do is we want to add a space before the paragraph. So that's going to add a space above these two lines of text. So if you go here, we can try a 6-point spacing, and we can see that that's far from correct. So here we might want, if we jump to 12, it's very close. There we go. 12 looks very close. But you can, if you want it to become even more precise, you can go here, line spacing options, and manually enter something like an 11-point spacing until it looks like it's perfectly justified. But 12 is generally going to be correct because though that font there should still be 12. Okay, so we've set our first question. Now we're going to move on to question 2. So I just went through some past papers until I found a tricky question that would be a challenge to set. And I got this one from the grade 12 November 2014 paper. It has a hyperbola with asymptotes, quite a few labels here. The equation is given right in the middle of the text. So I thought this would be a good example to try and work through to match this as close as we can. So in question 2 here, you'll notice that it's missing a blurb. Now you could simply copy using this by selecting that. We copy the whole cell. We give ourselves some space. Question 2. You can change the font here. Now you'll notice that we do work with the different styles here. So headings will be bold and capitalized. You can just click next to it and make it normal and then start typing your blurb. Or you can copy the blurb that I've provided you in question 3. You can copy and paste that as your blurb. So let's type this blurb. Okay, so we'll notice that when we've typed out this whole long story here, again, our g of x equation here is not, this right-hand part here is not in the correct font size. So you can split these cells. One of the ways to do it is to split these cells. You can make a column here, another column here, and then these 2 rows of text you can put on their own line. So I can go here and I want to insert a row right below. I would copy everything I want on the next 2 lines. Control X to cut, Control V to paste here. And then I can split this cell. Another way to find it is to right click, choose split cells. I'm going to split it into 3 columns. I'm going to take my equation, cut it, paste it in the middle, take the last bit of text, cut it, paste it over there. I'm going to move this right to the end of the row, and then I move this until everything fits in there. Again, we would have to play with the line spacing here, right, to match up there. So with this, I think I've still got a space here. We go. And you'll see here, I probably need to move this word onto the next line as well. Okay, So we're now pretty close. Again, if we change the line spacing for this row, line spacing options, add before, make it 12 point, choose this thing, the width, line spacing options, before 12 points. Now we're getting pretty close, and we might also want to increase the line spacing between these two rows of text, but at least our fonts are matching. I would have to go here and decrease this font spacing a little bit to match. There is another way that's slightly less technical to get this equation right in the middle of text. So I'm just going to undo, and we're back where we started. And the way to do that is to use a text box. So under insert, I'm going to choose a text box. I'm going to draw a text box. Yeah, the way we formatted it in this document shouldn't appear with a border, no cell width either, and with it being the only text in an equation, we can see here that we get the correct font size for the numerators and the denominators. So we can now delete the space there. And with this here above, we can now approximately position it. We're going to put a whole lot of spaces until we get to a situation where we've got sufficient space. Now, if I just drag this in there, I can do the alignment quite easily. However, you've got a huge overlap now between this denominator and the rest of the text. So again, the easiest way, and to help legibility for learners, we highlight all of our text, and we can now go and increase the font spacing here until we get something that looks correct. So 1.5, even 2 would probably be okay here. So I'm going to make it 1.5, and then we just make sure we've aligned this. You can, once the box is outlined like this, you can use your arrow keys on your keyboard to match it. So I think that's probably going to be the easier way when you've got a fraction right in the middle of a blurb like this. Okay, so the next thing now is that we're going to insert our graph. Now the graphs, I am going to suggest that we draw them in the separate program called Graph. And I will have a full tutorial on how to do that. But for this tutorial, you can take the graph that I have drawn, which here is the hyperbola example. So you'll notice the extension here says graph. If I double click on and open it, here is the graph that I've drawn. This will be available for you. You can see everything that I've created here and how I've drawn this graph. And the size of the window also impacts on the size of the graph in the picture. But for now, you just open this graph. We're going to go here, edit, and we're going to copy it as an image. As I've copied it as an image, this is the next very important step. We're going to go up to our paste, but we're not just going to paste it in, because then it will paste it as a picture, which means you can't edit it really afterwards. You'd have to open the file, edit it, paste it as a new picture. Graph does allow you to embed the graph within Word. You choose the paste options. You need to choose paste special. One of this, you notice that the default there is to embed it as a picture. But right at the top here, you can paste it as a graph system object. So if we choose that and we click OK, we now get this graph. Now you'll notice here that this is far too large. However, this, as long as this graph is not within a table, it needs to be just in a normal text field in Word. If we right click on this, we've got an option now for a picture. So we choose the picture options, and under size, the way we've set up graph is always to be double size. That's so it prints nicely when we scale it down. So here you're going to choose the height, and you can type in or use the arrow keys to go down to a 50. lock the aspect ratio, this will change and we'll keep it square. And now we have a 50% size here. Now, something I should have mentioned beforehand is that question 2 really should be on its own page, especially with such a graph, large picture, a long question coming ahead of it. So to ensure that question 2 always starts on its own page, we go into the layout section of our page. We're going to choose a break, and then we choose a page break. Now you'll notice it starts there in question 2. There is a shortcut key to do that, which is to hold down Control and then push Enter. And that immediately inserts a page break for the new page. Okay, so here we've now inserted our graph. Click on this once here, and we can still treat this like anything else where we can center, justify the picture. The nice thing is here's my graph. If I close this graph, it still keeps my graph here. I'm just going to save. If I double click on this graph, my graph program is not open. I'm just going to double click on the graph. It then launches the graph program. You can see it's even referring to the document I'm working in here. And here now we can go and make any changes. And those changes are immediately updated within this graph. Okay, so let's go and set a new question here. Question 3. I'm going to Control Enter. Now for this one here, we still need a blurb. We're not going to have a graph object. You'll notice that I've said graph object needs to be not in a table. But if I go down here, I have provided you with a drawing canvas for geometry. Now, working in a drawing canvas with geometry prevents that age-old problem we've had with drawings in Word, where you just push Enter or you move one object on page 1 and your drawing on page 7 shifts. Okay? Working with a drawing canvas, this thing is now the object that's embedded in Word, and we can then go and modify things within the drawing canvas, and it shouldn't be affected by anything we do outside of the canvas. So I'm going to take my drawing canvas, I'm going to cut it, Control X, I'm going to paste it here. All right, now though I've provided you with a triangle, that's more just to show you where the drawing canvas is. I do suggest that you draw most of your geometric objects with straight lines. If it's a straight line object, draw it with straight lines. Obviously, there's exceptions for something like a hexagon where you can use the predefined shape, but triangles become really tricky to work with, especially if you want to rotate things like that. You get these weird edges that sometimes become problematic. So I'm going to delete that object. I'm going to go here and construct a fairly simple geometric diagram, something that a grade 8 or 9 would be used to. So under Insert, in Shape here, we go and choose a straight line. Again, the way I've set up this document, your line width is 1 point, and it's in black immediately. So you don't have to be changing that for every line you draw if you start off with this template. Okay, so I've drawn my first diagonal line there. Now, if I want to have a parallel line, of course they don't actually have to look parallel, but if you copy and then paste that object, you've now got a line which is definitely parallel. A short way to do that is when you've selected the object, you hold down Control, and then you can drag for a new object. If you want this line to be of a slightly different length without changing the angle of this line so that it still looks parallel, holding down Shift and then dragging will keep the line parallel. In other words, the orientation the same, just changing the length. So I can do something like that. All right, let's go and add in a couple more lines here. So you'll notice that just choosing that tool, one thing that I've found causes the most headaches is if you label your diagram too soon within Word. then you get all those snapping issues with the text boxes. So we're going to draw all of our geometric objects first without any labels. Now, sometimes you might want to zoom in so that you can try and make things move nicely. So you've got your zoom tools down here at the bottom. I hold down Control and use my mouse wheel to allow me to zoom in and out. Okay, right. These lines are parallel. We should indicate that. Probably the most straightforward way, especially for grade 8s and 9s, is to just draw little lines here until we look like we've got an arrow. This does take a little bit of trial and error, but that looks like a decent arrow for me. One tip here, I'm holding down Control as I select them. Now I can select multiple items, and I can choose to group those items. Then I can copy this arrow, Control-C, Control-V, or I hold down Control, and when I have this plus icon with my mouse, I can copy it, drag it down here, and copy that item, and we now have parallel lines indicated there. Okay, before we label, we might want to do one more thing, which is to indicate a certain angle. So I see many people on the test trying to use the curve to try and draw, and we get weird angles that look like that. It is a much neater way of drawing an angle, which is in your shapes thing here. Instead of using a curve, we use an arc. When you draw an arc, it will always draw just a quarter arc, a quarter of a circle. To make your life easier, especially with flat 2D plane drawings, we're going to go here and match using the height and width. Just match it so that it's a square. Now, these two yellow icons allow you to extend your arc. But what I would suggest you do first is you use the vertical and the horizontal midpoints and try and align those with the center of your vertex. Don't worry about these things here. We can change those afterwards. All I'm looking to do is to try and align, basically, it doesn't have to be perfect, the midpoints of my square box with the center of the vertex. Then we use our yellow end to go to that, and our yellow end to go to that. Now that's a perfectly good angle representation, but we might want to add an arrow onto either end. So with my arc selected, I go into the shape outline options. I go down here to arrows, and then you can choose an end style for either one of those. So I'm going to choose arrow style 6, and now I have a beautiful angle indicating the exterior angle of that triangle. All right, let's now go and add in our labels. We've drawn all the geometry we need to. We now go, and you can use this text box here. You can also use the text box that's under insert. They're the same one. However, if we insert a text box here, you'll notice that it still doesn't have a border around it, which is good, but it does have this outline. That outline can actually be very useful in geometry while you're building up your project, because it shows you exactly where your text box is located. All right, so we have our P here. Now I'm going to resize it so that my text box is not too massive. If your text boxes are too huge, then they overlap each other and it becomes difficult to select it. You'll also notice that this text is Times New Roman to match the same font as our blurb and the rest of our paper. So I drag it down here, label it there. If we want to get rid of this square, we go into the shape format, the shape outline, and we choose no outline. And there's a label for our line. All right, let me quickly go here and label the rest of the points I want. I'm holding down Control, drag in there, or you can do Control-C, Control-V. I tend to just put all my text boxes without worrying about the letters, although I inevitably forget to go and change one of the letters. I'm going to do another couple for the angle sizes that I'm providing them with here and there. I'm going to do another one to label this angle here as an unknown. And then I'm going to do another couple here inside there. This here is going to be my small letter. So let's go through and change them. Okay, this P here, I don't want it to be P. I'm going to delete that there. I'm going to now insert an equation. And so I can type 23, and then I can insert my degree symbol to indicate the size of that. I just extend the text box because it looks a little bit longer. Move my 23 there. This angle up here is going to be 47. I'm going to use a shortcut that I set up for degrees. And I'll show you how to do that shortcut in the equation editor video. This here, I want to have a little letter. So I'm going to go and change it to a 1. And then I'm going to go here and change the font size to size 10 to indicate a smaller letter. I'm going to copy that next to it and make that 2. And there's my picture now that I've got ready to go and type in my blurb. When it comes to using parallel, I'm going to indicate here PQ, and I'm going to use shift with the backspace, which gives me 2 vertical lines, to SR. Okay. You can use the symbols here. These symbols, you can first of all extend it to see all of these symbols here. These are under basic math. But there are other symbols that we can get here, Greek letters, letter-like symbols, and you'll notice at the bottom is geometry. And so here you've got some angle symbols, perpendicular, the perpendicular that we tend to use, and here is our parallel. So you can use that parallel symbol as well. Okay, to insert the angle symbol above my S, you can choose it as an accent here and there. So under there is my S. And then normally we don't have this italic. So we highlight that thing and we're going to take off the italics that come with equation editor. All right, there's my blurb. Now I can show you another way to do parallel lines. If these parallel lines become difficult, I notice what they do in matric exams is that they just use a triangle symbol overlaid on the line. So now that we have a text boxes here, I'm going to copy a text box here. I'm going to now go and look for, and you only have to do this once. Under symbols here, you'll notice that I have some commonly used symbols here. But if I choose more symbols, now under Times New Roman, the font, here are, and there's a huge amount of symbols. So you will need to go and search for these. The triangle symbol that I found here is right down near the bottom. And here, if we choose the right facing triangle, we can click on insert. And so there now I have this triangle. I'm going to move it above there, but you'll notice that this is a little bit weird because it's not following the same orientation as my line. So above it here, I've got the rotation tool. I just rotate it until the box is pretty much parallel. And there now I can go and overlay it on my line. And I copy and paste that. And that is another way to indicate on the diagram that the lines are parallel. Okay, let's look at question 4, which will make a slightly more challenging drawing to do. So I found a trig question. So you can see this is a trig question from February 2015, but I just chose it because it has some fairly complex angle indications and it has a shaded region. So, and these perpendicular lines that I know people struggle to draw. So this is a challenge. probably one of the more difficult diagrams you might have to try and draw. Okay, we're not going to worry too much about the blurb on this one here. We need to now bring a drawing canvas in. You can copy and paste this drawing canvas. I will show you how to insert a drawing canvas from the scratch. All right, so we go into insert shape, and then right down at the bottom here is a drawing canvas. And you want to make sure your drawing canvas is of a decent size to accommodate the full picture that we want to try and draw. So this is a very vertical picture. I'm giving myself a bit more height there. The first thing we want to draw is to draw a vertical line. So now if you draw it here, you can it becomes very tricky to try and get an absolutely vertical line. Often the easiest way to get a perfectly vertical line is to go up into your width here, choose this here and make your width 0, and then you guarantee that your line is vertical. You can also use the Alt key, which just provides you a little bit of snapping to get a vertical line. But even that you can see is not perfect. So you want to go here and use the width. I find the easiest way to guarantee a vertical line. Again, if we want to change the length of our line, I'm holding down Shift, and we can get a line that's the approximate right dimensions for our drawing. Let's go and draw the rest. Okay, that looks pretty good for a starting point. Let's still focus on drawing the lines. We'll come to the shaded region now. So if we want to indicate that these two sections here are right angled, we're going to use that same idea of parallel lines from the grade 9 thing. We're going to copy and paste this line. And we go up there until we have the approximate size of our box. I hold down Shift, and then we can keep that perspective the same. I need a vertical line here, so I hold down Control, copy that until we have it approximately correct, hold down Shift. And now we have a pretty decent right angle there that matches the already given lines in terms of being parallel. So we're going to quickly do the other one. This one here, I'm just going to match it exactly there. Shift. And there we go. So now I've indicated my two right angles. The arrow indicators from the question, we had an arrow up here that's not in a horizontal plane, an arrow down here, and an arrow for this angle here. So again, we're going to use our arc tool. I'm going to go and position it here, but based from the perspective of this image, I'm going to make this one a slightly skinnier angle, like that. Now, of course, the angle we need is from here below, so I'm going to take this around until it hits that angle, take this around, and there's my angle indicated with a fairly decent perspective to show that this is not a flat surface here. I go onto the end here, and we add an arrow in. Arrows. There's my one arrow. I'm going to copy this arrow, take it down here to the bottom. Now this one here, because of the perspective, I'm going to make it slightly a wider angle. And we can play around with the positioning of it until we get a decent perspective on that arrow. Okay, and then one more. Take these two ends, fix approximately there, and then we bring the ends in. And there we've indicated that third arrow, that third angle. We can also, you'll notice in the original metric paper that they use double arrows for this one and the other one. So that's what that would look like. You can have double arrows. So now let's go and put in the shading. Remember, we always leave labels until the absolute end. So now we want to shade this. And the way that I've found to do it, that's pretty effective. I'm going to use my triangle. I'm going to draw an approximate triangle here. Doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, I'll make it quite not perfect because it doesn't always work out that way. All right, this triangle, we're going to go and choose no outline, and we're going to choose a shape fill, and we're going to choose a fairly dark gray. Let's go with that gray. Okay, you do have to be careful in not having too dark a gray, especially if we're going to have labels over it. All right, now you'll notice that just using these arrows here, it becomes very difficult to match all 3 points. So with the triangle, and especially just for the shading now, we're going to use the edit shape function. And under the edit shape, we can edit the points. So my first point is on the one correct vertex. If I go near this black point, I can now drag it until it matches that vertex. And this black point, I can drag it, and now it matches that vertex. This still looks a little bit weird. It's very difficult to get it perfect, and we lost the black lines a little bit. So what I suggest you do, once you've got a pretty good, I think we can do a little bit better here. Edit points. This one we can just drag down a little bit. That looks better. Still a little bit of white there, but that's okay. Select your shaded region, and in your options here under your shape format, we can send it to the back. Now we've got our angles back, we've got distinct lines there, and we've got a shaded region at the bottom. Now the last thing that's left to do is to do our labeling. Okay, so here we have a fairly complex diagram that if we use some of the shortcuts and the methods I've suggested, I really don't think it takes too long to draw this type of diagram. Okay, so this is the last question within our template. So what I'm going to do now to make a question 5, we're going to highlight these pre-given question 4. We're going to make a bit of a space here, Control V, we're going to change this to 5. Leave space for a blurb. Start this on the new page. Bring in an initial numbering. Give it some space. And within this space here, we insert another drawing canvas, and we'll just show you how to do axes for a Cartesian plane and a circle. Okay, so as you can see here, this is from a metric paper, and we've got a diagonal line here, circle with a diameter, line segment, X and Y axes, and also some points that need to be labeled. All right, so to draw our axes, we can use this arrow tool, but we want to try and distinguish our axes from other lines. So I start off here with a horizontal line, making the height 0, taking a vertical line with a width of 0. So there are my axes. What we're going to do for these two lines, under shape outline, we go to arrows, and then we're going to choose this style of arrow to indicate axes. There we go. There's our axes. We won't label them yet. We won't introduce text boxes yet. We're going to draw our full picture. Okay, let's go and draw our circle. If you go here and you just draw a circle, that's not a circle, that's an ellipse. You can go here and modify your sizes and match them here to get 5. 5, 5. All right, and that's a pretty good circle. There is a way, using the shape tool here, that if you hold down Shift and then you draw it, it immediately is a perfect circle. And if you hold down Shift while resizing it, you will always maintain a perfect circle. Okay, so I'm going to position this here approximately with the correct y-intercepts according to the diagram. We're going to add in a diameter first. You'll notice that this does have some snapping points in the circle, so you do have to be a little bit careful about those, but they can be normally avoided pretty easily. And we go there and we draw our diameter. And I'm drawing the diameter first, approximately. You can actually find the center of the circle using those midpoints of the two sides, should you really want an accurate drawing. And now that I've got this point of tangency here, I'm going to draw in my tangent, and I can position it fairly accurately using the arrow keys. And there we go. Okay, now this line here, analytically geometry, is an infinite line. So we're going to choose our shape outline. We're going to go to arrows, and we're going to choose the other end styles. So now I've distinguished my axes from this line that's given. All right, so those are the important points, all the drawings of the lines that we need. Now let's go and introduce our labels. I'm not using an equation editor to type the coordinates of this point. I'm just using Times New Roman for these labels here. Unless you have something like square roots or something, you should be able to use just the normal text to label that point. They always label the origin with a capital 0, not with a, capital O, not a 0. And then here we have B. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now, if we go back to the reference thing here, we'll notice that they have actually indicated points there. Now, I don't suggest you try and use the circle to indicate those 2 points. I think there's an easier way, which is to again use text and to use a symbol from the text thing. So I'm going to go here under insert symbol. You'll notice that I've already got it saved there, but you should be able to find it within your either your Times New Roman or your symbol font. But there's a black dot. I double clicked it or click insert, and there it is. It's maybe a little bit big, so I'm going to bring down the size. But now I can go and put a point at that intersection, and I can also mark the center of my circle. And I find that's a little bit easier than trying to work with really, really tiny little circle shapes. Okay, not forgetting to label our axes. And there we go. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, the last thing that I know some people have had some difficulty drawing in the past is a cumulative frequency or an ogive. So you can do this within Excel and import it across. However, I generally find that it's easier to work from within Word from the beginning. So we're going to copy here a question 5 on a new page, make it question 6. Bring in a starting question, and underneath our blurb, we're going to insert. So here we're going to go and insert a chart. Now, I find that XY scatter is the most flexible in terms of drawing either cumulative frequencies or scatter plots. So we're going to use an XY scatter, and we get this lovely picture here. What we need to do here is to enter our values that we want to use on our ogive. The X values here would be 0. If we look back at the graph here, you're going to enter the beginning of each interval, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then finishing on 60. You'll notice that it does increase the range as you go to 60. All right, the purple and the blue things here. All right, and then you go and enter your Y values that you need to match. Okay, so here I've entered my data now, but this chart is a long way from looking like this one here, where we have a whole grid system, we have labels on both of our axes, and the font doesn't match either. So let's start correcting some of those things here. the first thing we want to do is you click on this here, and then we want to add minor grid lines. Click on your vertical axis and add minor grid lines for a cumulative frequency graph. We also notice that all of these lines are incredibly faint, and the scaling here also might not be what we want. So if we right click on here, we can format that axis. So we're happy with going from 0, but maybe we don't want to go all the way to 60, 70. We want to go to just to 60. So we can change that here. Here, our major grid lines, we're going up in tens. That's fine. But our minor grid lines, perhaps we would prefer to go up in single digits, 1. So you can see that gave me a lot more definition within there. Our vertical axis, our minimum is 0, but our maximum here is 140. So you can go up and make it 140. Major units here would probably make more sense to go up in tens, as long as that doesn't get too cramped. And our minor axis here, because of the reduced scale here, perhaps we want to leave that at 2. While we're on these here, let's go and change the font to match Times New Roman, and to change this font here as well to Times New Roman. Okay. You can increase your font, your scale of your graph a little bit here as well to make your scales for your axes more appropriate. Now let's go and see how we've changed these grid lines here. So if you click here, you can actually go here and say format the grid lines. But once you're in this menu, you can see here that you've got all your formatting options. So these are my major grid lines. I'm going to change the color to a much, you can even go to black or a very dark gray. Let's go darker than that. And I also find to increase the width to at least 1,25 is a good idea. So I've done those ones. I want to make my vertical axes match. So I'm going to immediately go here and choose my vertical major grid lines. Choose that same dark gray, 1.25. Okay, so now my horizontal and vertical grid lines, the major ones are matching. You can go here and format the grid lines, but now we're on our minor grid line options, and you could have stayed within this here to choose the minor axes. We'll make these 1 point, and we'll still keep them a very dark color. Perhaps that's a little too dark. Maybe make them a little bit skinnier. There we go. And we're going to change here to our vertical axis, minor grid lines. Just change it to that same dark color. There we go. That's looking much more appropriate for a cumulative frequency graph. You can change these marker colors here. So by choosing that with this dialog open here you can choose the line. We don't have a line there. We're going to choose the marker options. The border for that, we can have no border, which is more normal. And the fill here, we're going to have a solid fill. And you can see it's chosen black. We can also choose black here. So now we have appropriate markings there. How do we add titles in here? So with your chart selected, you've got options here under chart design, formatting. We're going to go under chart design, and we're going to add a chart element. Axis title, primary horizontal, axis title, primary vertical, and we have got a heading here. So the axis title here, and then this top one here, we change this here to be. All right, now you'll notice the font is still incorrect for these axis title. The quickest way to change all of your fonts in one go is once you've done all of your labels, you select the whole graph, and then you just come up here in your font here, and you're going to choose Times New Roman, and that fixes these. We just bold it. Okay, and you can still, this will readjust according to that. Now the final thing, the very last thing, once you've got an appropriate scale, once you've labeled everything, once you've formatted your data points, is to draw in the Ogive curve. You can try and use a trend line, but it never goes through all the exact points. So the easiest, but again, it has to happen right at the end because it's drawn in by hand, is to use your curve. So you go into your drawing, just like you would for drawing in a drawing canvas, and choose your curve. I find it easier to start on the right, go carefully through, and you might have to do this a couple of times if you notice, because it does a sort of Bezier curve around some of the points. So you just try and go through the center of each point, and there we end. And at the end, we double click, and that confirms our line. We go through here and check. It's pretty good through most of the points. You can treat this like any other line. You can increase the weight of it if you want, or decrease the weight of it, but 1 point is generally good enough. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in terms of covering the most commonly used skills in setting exams. And at the end, we have a pretty consistent test that should be familiar for learners. Please feel free to ask me if there's skills that I haven't covered here. The next video will focus on drawing graphs like this hyperbola from scratch in Graph. And finally, we'll look at some shortcuts that we can use in Equation Editor, all to make the process more efficient. Thanks for your time.